Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Claire Allen, and I'm a Nature Climate Sustainability Lead for Arup. I have the great pleasure of chairing and welcoming you to this session, part of the Arup webinar series, Digital Horizons. Today, we will be exploring how is digital helping to deliver a net zero, climate resilient, and nature positive world. Digital approaches, including the use of computational models, artificial intelligence, digital twins, Earth observation, and smart technologies are transforming activities across the economy and society. It is widely used to automate and optimize production processes, but we can also use digital approaches to map and monitor and create early warning systems, and this will be essential for the challenges associated with climate, nature, and net zero. Digital can help us explore the relationships between the interconnections of complex systems. The nexus between net zero, climate, and nature is one of the most complex systems that we need to understand. Digital approaches provide great opportunities to mitigate and adapt to climate change and prevent nature and biodiversity loss. And this session will explore how digital is helping to deliver a net zero, climate resilient, and nature positive world. I'm delighted to introduce our panel this afternoon. Annette Figueredo, who is the Principal Programme and Policy Officer for the Greater London Authority. Annette works for the GLA on climate adaptation policy and delivery. In this capacity, she works across a range of sectors, including health and social care, housing and education. She is also the lead for heat risk policy and delivery work in London. Melanie Colburn is the Director of Innovation and Research for the US Green Building Council. Melanie is passionate about advancing sustainable practices. Her work focuses on analysing emerging trends to drive strategic innovation and strengthen the US GBC's thought leadership in decarbonisation and climate resilience. Craig Holland is the Senior Director of Investments and Brightstorm Programme Lead at the Nature Conservancy, where he spearheads global strategies to enhance water quality and availability, develops environmental markets, and scales innovative technologies. He currently serves on the expert task force for the Global Commission on Nature Positive Cities within the World Economic Forum. Brady Cline is a sales director at ESRI with over 25 years of applying software and data science to addressing challenges across public and private sectors. Brady currently leads ESRI's business development for advanced analytics and AI, which supports across all businesses and government sectors. Prior to joining ESRI, he was part of the leadership team of an early stage AI startup focused on the commercial and financial industries and enabling them to utilize best-in-breed artificial intelligence tools for spatial data extractions. And today's keynote speaker is Remi, who is the Director of Sustainability Research of the Schneider Electric Research Institute. As the Director of Sustainability Research, Remi uses his 20 years of experience within the energy sector to research the interconnectedness of energy transition, digital transformation, and sustainability. His work focuses on the modelling and policy analysis of digital-related topics such as critical minerals, the role of digital technologies on climate action, digital resiliency, artificial intelligence, and the quantification of digital technologies' broader impact on sustainability. But before we kick off with our keynote speaker, here are a few words from the Global Digital Services Lead at Arup, Will Cavendish.
Welcome to Arup's global webinar series, Digital Horizons. It's fantastic to bring people together, both on our panel and online, to explore a topic that I know many of us care deeply about: how we can use digital to achieve meaningful impact in shaping a better future for the built environment. Many people here will be confronting the same generational challenge we're facing here at Arup. How can we meet the human needs of the roughly 10 billion people that will soon be living on our planet, while at the same time reducing significantly the huge and detrimental environmental footprint of our sector? Through this 3-day webinar series, we want to explore how digital, data technology, and AI can support us in meeting this challenge. Part of this is about providing real-world, tangible examples of where we're already making progress to inspire and give a legitimate sense of hope, but also to explore some of the barriers to getting the most out of these solutions and figure out how we can all go further, faster. The good news is that many organisations have already been busy developing digital solutions that tackle some of our biggest sustainability challenge. There's been a strong focus on reducing carbon, improving climate resilience, and regenerating nature, our topics for today. For example, at Arup, we're already employing digital solutions at different scales to promote sustainability outcomes. At the individual project level, our total digital design solution uses generative design to enhance our expertise, automate workflows, and embed sustainability right at the heart of the design process. This allows us to improve building and district design and reduce both embodied and operational carbon. At an organisational scale, we've developed digital solutions like CRISP and IRIS that help our clients map and understand their carbon and climate resilience baselines across entire property portfolios, informing decarbonisation and resilience investments and asset management strategies that shape a better and more resilient future. Finally, at the city and national level, we've developed our Observe suite of tools that use the power of machine learning and satellite data to help tackle key sustainability challenges. For example, using UHeat to map the urban heat hotspots and to model which interventions can help mitigate these heat waves. Or been mapping habitats on a large scale, understanding how to manage project footprints to improve biodiversity and identify areas for restoration. We firmly believe that the pathway to a low-carbon, resilient, biodiverse future runs through digital. So as a sector, we've already developed many of the digital solutions needed to address today's most urgent challenges. But the speed of their implementation remains a significant hurdle. Despite the clear potential of these technologies, we often struggle to deploy them at the pace required. This lag is partly due to a lack of capabilities in key areas such as data management, digital literacy, and the integration of digital solutions across whole sectors. But perhaps we also need to be stronger advocates of these approaches with clients, with governments, with investors and others who play a significant role in shaping what we can do. We need to do all we can to bridge the gap between innovation and real-world impact, enabling digital technologies to play the crucial role in building a more sustainable and resilient future. These and many more are some of the issues I hope our panel will address, bringing examples from across sectors and across the world and highlighting best practice. I hope you all enjoy.
You will, that was great. Now straight over to our keynote speaker, Remi. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Arup, for the opportunity to share with you on a big question: how is digital helping deliver a net zero, climate resilience, and nature positive world? My name is Remi Paccou. I'm a research director at Schneider Electric Sustainability Research Institute. We are a think tank on climate issues and energy transition, and Schneider Electric is a global group with the ambition to limit the effects of climate change through electrification and digitalization of the energy system. So when Arup asked me to discuss about that question a couple of days ago, I thought that maybe a way to address it was to think about what would be the missing link between these three elements: net zero, resiliency, and nature positive. And finally, it led me to this, a donut. So you might think it's a joke, and perhaps it's a bit of a joke, but in fact, a donut is much more than that. It's a powerful approach to understanding the complex interactions between net zero, resiliency, and nature positive world. So this approach is now quite well known. It has been developed by an economist, Kate Raworth, and it offers a mental map that describes planet boundaries. What is very interesting here is that regardless of the topic of human activity, there is always a connection to this donut. And very naturally, digital is part of that. So it helps to understand that the current situation is a legacy of past transition, whether they are energetic or digital, and it's linked to a certain model of development that don't integrate planetary limits. When we look a bit back, we observe that many of energy transition stories are not simple as we think. And in fact, energy transition are essentially due to changes in uses or demands, and they often span 60 to 70 years. What is very singular with our time is that for the first time in human history, planet boundaries force us to act faster and stronger, and it's about 3 times at a global scale. And this has never happened before. At Schneider, we believe that the most realistic path to mitigate climate change while staying within planet boundaries is the one that built on human progress and also on digital as a kind of acceleration tool. Perhaps you know Václav Smil. I like him very much. He's a scientist doing research which encompasses energy, environment, food, population, economy. It's very multidisciplinary. And he's trying to understand what are the complex relationship between energy transition, digital transition, but also environment. He has a very systemic vision and is a bit a kind of guide for the way we address the research on that topic at Schneider. What is very interesting when we look at the energy transitions is that historians now have enough knowledge and they have demonstrated that historical energy transition introduce new source of energy production without phasing out existing ones. So this results in a kind of continuous increase in overall energy production. And it's important to understand that digital shouldn't be the same, shouldn't be an add-on in addition to other energy systems, but should be integrated into this system. And the effects of that integration can be compatible or incompatible with ecological transition. An obvious example is AI, which is part of a lot of discussion, is a very clear example. It requires a lot of energetical infrastructure and potential effects on fossil fuels consumption because there are still some data centers powered with coal-based energy. But it also helps to address some very important problems that humans can't solve by themselves in climate science, medicine, or decarbonization. Unfortunately, we see that fossil count still for a very large share of primary energy, even if we see some positive regional dynamics like in the US or in Europe. But again, unfortunately, here we must admit that we are on the track to have consumed most of the carbon budget for reaching 1.5 degrees. What needs to be understood there is that all the emissions we don't emit today will not be part of the cumulated emission or the capital of emission in the future. So in other words, the truly effective way of abating climate change is to act now, so speed of execution and scale of transformation are super important. And here, digital can potentially help. So we studied the concrete case of buildings and cities, and we consider it as a kind of easy to abate sector. Concretely, if we want to reach a maximum of 1.5 degree increase by 2030, that means a very, very massive investment in a modern infrastructure. So that should be massive electrification at end use with heat pumps, decarbonizing power with solar PV essentially on the rooftop, but also a lot of new net zero construction that should be the norm in the future, and a rate of retrofit which is much faster than today. So this is a colossal transformation, and digital can help on accelerating this transformation with a kind of viral manner when it is used very precisely. So this is the vision of one academic we are working with, who is a Professor Charlie Wilson from Oxford University, and he develops this approach in his academic work under the term high with low. That means deploying technology wisely so that the impact on the necessary infrastructure, whether it is material, energy, human capital, digital capital, environmental capital, is as low as possible for maximum benefits. So we did some research about that, and what we understood about especially buildings is that digital can ultimately be used in two main ways. The first one is to couple digital technology with the right decarbonization technology. So very concretely, we have quantified that coupling digital solution with heating, electrification, and rooftop solar panel will demultiply the benefits of installing these equipments alone. We have quantified that, and it's about a carbon abatement from 15 to 80% across segments, with significant energy savings both for building owners but also residents, with limited impact on the grids, and at cost, which is absolutely important in terms of energy justice and access to the transition. So this is for us a practical systemic effect of digital, and we have documented that in a couple of publications. Also, a major discussion is about artificial intelligence. So many things have been said, but I would like to bring maybe a couple of facts and figures that would potentially help to understand better the link between this digital arm and the energy transition and the environment. A first research topic we have is about the evolution of the computing power of AI models. And there are multiple types of AI models, from large to tiny, but the best known to the general public is essentially for personal uses, and is very often based on deep learning or Gen AI. But when we look at the computing power of AI model from the past, from the 15 last years, what is very interesting is to see that it is always growing in terms of need to train the models. That's normal. But the pace of growth is quite high depending on the model. So if you take, for example, a deep learning model or the Gen AI model, it will be about 4 to 5% per year, time per year acceleration, versus a pre-deep learning compute model that we can call traditional AI, which will be around 1.3, 1.4 per year, so much more linear. And what is very interesting here is to see that to train Gemini Ultra, which is the top model from Google now, we know that the most the compute power needed to train that model is estimated around 5 exponential 25 flops. And to compare it, it's about 50 billion supercomputers from beginning of the 80s. So the big question we have, and we don't have the answer, but we are studying that at least, is do we need all this computed power to decarbonize at scale, to go for net zero, to make things resilient, and to be nature positive? We don't know yet. So it could be a possibility, but it's not certain. Gen AI have potentially a lot of use cases. But however, what we know is that the traditional AI models, which have proven for decades, are based on practices and processes knowledge. So they are very effective today. And they have been listed by a very interesting organization called Climate Change.ai and studied very concretely on the end uses, typically healthcare, grids, buildings, industry, that we can find really a hotspot between the weight of the infrastructure versus the impact for decarbonization. Another research topic about AI is the limitation of quality data. It's not very famous, but it's for us super important because it is related to the nature of data we need to make strong progress about digital and the environment. What we know today is that the stock of data generated by human activity as a whole and available can tend to a certain plateau over time. So the question is, what kind of model do we want? Do we want always more data to feed some big models? Or do we think also that we might need the right data from the right processes that we train very specifically from the application standpoint and not from the general standpoint? And so the question is about quality or quantity, what is the right rationale? And maybe both sometimes. So typical qualified data will be about ground level. It will be about demand side users. It will be about knowing precisely what is happening inside the buildings, inside the healthcare facilities, inside every kind of existing infrastructure for a human activity. So the big challenge is to find the hotspot, again, low with high, high with low, between the right AI model and the most impact. What we study also is the cost of the models for AI, which is something which is not so much discussed, but which is for us very important because it is related to the potential development of AI at scale. And there is a kind of trend which seems to be more and more confirmed, is that AI is becoming expensive and it will continue to be expensive. And that is raising the question of the accessibility of computing power for training models for customers, but also for public sectors, for communities. So there is a big discussion here, a big debate, which is very interesting, finding the hotspot between the right investment, the right compute power, and the right need of data to have a model which is at the right scale for the maximum impact. And this is a very important area of focus for us. So we did work on that quite intensively for the last months, and we did publish recently a paper about that, which is called AI for Impact. Where we identify some use cases which we believe might have a very strong impact on climate change mitigation. So we did a critical review for 40 years of all the scientific literature, but also the grey industry sources literature. And we propose a list, which is for sure not exhaustive, but open for debate, about the most promising AI energy application, which really significantly can contribute to climate change mitigation in a systemic manner. We identify 10 use cases and on buildings, especially 3, where we believe that we have a potential very interesting focus. And I will talk about one especially, which is AI-powered HVAC for buildings. So I wanted to end this keynote by presenting this very concrete example. This is a project with the municipality of Stockholm on the educational buildings, where Schneider Electric use AI for well-being, efficiency, and decarbonization. So it's about Stockholm Inner City School Board. They are responsible of ownership, but operation and maintenance of over 600 buildings, assets, and they have an annual energy budget about 24 million euros, so quite intense. They have simple objective, energy cost reduction, non-intrusive AI implementation, real-time data analysis, occupants comfort, occupants engagement, so kind of multidisciplinary criteria which make potentially AI interesting as a systemic effect. Here we use traditional proven reinforcement learning AI, which is something fully industrialized, and we have the specific knowledge of the domain about HVAC. So the results are quite interesting because we measured that over a period of 1 year, and we discovered that we have good impacts on the environmental, occupancy comfort, economic viability sides, and hence it's a practical use case of a systemic effect of AI. So to conclude and try to answer to the question that was asked and posed by Arup, I think that yes, digital solution can help address net zero resilience and tend towards a nature positive, but with 3 important conditions or criteria. One is to try to think systemic. Second is to be very data grounded and focus on what is happening in the physical reality of the energy use. And third, trying to find the use cases where you can have a high impact with a low infrastructure. Thank you very much for the attention, and I hand over to Claire.
Thank you, Remi. That was really, really great. Very inspirational, interesting talk. I'm going to build upon that talk for our panel discussion. I think it's brilliant that you've gone and brought those themes in. And audience, just to also let you know that if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat function, and we will ask our experts during the Q&A after the panel discussion. So I'm now going to go on ask a question to Brady. What I'd really like you to do actually is give a sort of 20-second summary about what ESRI does, just to help our audience understand where you fit into this kind of big picture of understanding digital approaches relating to nature, climate, and net zero. So if you can do that, Brady, and then it'd be really fantastic if you could give us some I'd really like to explore with all of our panelists examples of how digital approaches can help with our challenges associated with climate, net zero, and nature. So Brady, if over to you.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. Brady Cline. I'd say I come from ESRI. ESRI is kind of the world-renowned GIS company in the world. So supporting all things kind of the digital view of the physical world, what we've been doing for the last 50 years. So kind of going back to what you had just kind of asked around how do we see this and how does it work? Well, most of what we're doing with our customers, which range from national governments and state and local governments to commercial organizations, it's really about measuring the data, right? The collection of that data, and then creating a way to measure these impacts. So, going back to the conversations around AI and the data that was going through there, and the physical cost of processing those things. And I really like the comment around the digital currency of energy being kind of one of those things, because as you gave my blurb earlier, I'm the AI guy for ESRI. AI is very costly. So what we're really looking at doing is bringing in all of the data elements that we can for our customers, so they can highlight where those net zero changes are, what the remedy to those solutions can be, and how they can model that in, I won't call it a digital twin, I'll call it a digital representation, but that view of the world.
That's great. That sounds really interesting. And Melanie, I think you had some, wanted to kind of discuss some of the broader changes, trends as well. So if you again could give a quick 20-second blurb about where you're from and what that means, and then if you can go and elaborate on the longer the trends that you were talking about earlier.
Happy to, Claire. Thank you everyone for the invite to be here today. Yes, USGBC, I think you know us. We're the nonprofit member-led organization that has the most widely recognized green building standard in the world, and in pertinent to this conversation, really centering ourselves on biodiversity and ecosystem restoration with LEED v5 in the future. But to your question around digital approaches, USGBC is a member organization, and it's really our members that are doing the most interesting work on this front, including some of the folks on the call today, including Europe. But I'm happy to speak to some of the broader digital trends that we're seeing. With digitization, buildings are going from being energy consumers to active players in creating the infrastructure for net zero and our capacity for climate resilience. And last year, USGBC released the State of Decarbonization report in collaboration with Europe, and I'd like to highlight just a couple of takeaways from that. The report points to the critical role that advanced energy efficiency has played in decoupling growth from carbon emissions in the U.S. commercial building sector over the past 30 years. And while this is an incredible achievement and so important, at the same time, looking forward, we're unlikely to see significant progress in energy efficiency in buildings without it hinging largely on gains from smart building augmentation. And one of these critical digitization technologies we point to in the report is grid interactive building systems, or what we call GEBs in the US. And according to the GSA, our government entity around government buildings, which based on work on NREL, energy management information systems and automated system optimization can reduce energy use by 5 to 11%. And so GEBs are important not just for enabling sustained energy access in the places we live, work, and play during peak events like heat waves and storms, but they then become essential for our climate resilience. And we, according to the IEA, we're on track almost to triple our renewable energy use by 2030, but that still won't be enough as we bring more EVs and we electrify more buildings. So this is critical for the kind of, as Remi was pointing to, the broader ecosystem and kind of looking for that systemic change in sustainability and resilience as we think about meeting all of our goals together. And so right now, only about 5% of buildings today are modernized in manner to take advantage of the latest technologies like GEBs, according to a report by Deloitte. And so we're going to see massive change in the way we site, design, and operate buildings over the next 10 to 15 years. That will then allow us to focus on peak carbon, which is really what we need to do to combat climate change. I hope that's helpful to you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Melanie. And you mentioned there, you touched upon buildings and how buildings may be more susceptible for extreme weather caused by climate change. And I was wondering if I could go over to Annette, if you could talk to us about your experience of using digital approaches for the Greater London Authority. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Claire, and hello, everybody. My name's Annette Figueredo, and I work for the Greater London Authority, as Claire's mentioned. It's an organisation headed by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and the Mayor has a number of legal responsibilities, one of which is to ensure that London meets its challenges on climate change, and that's both mitigation and adaptation. So in terms of Remi's presentation, fantastic presentation, Remi, very much focused on net zero, of course, and what we at the GLA are trying to do is focus on the Mayor reaching that net zero target for London by 2030. But alongside that, we already have climate change and we have a climate emergency. And the focus has to be on how we're tackling the climate emergency now, which includes buildings, which includes protecting people, particularly vulnerable people, at-risk groups, and which includes protecting our ecosystems as well. So the Mayor has a number of strategies, and I sit within the climate adaptation team, and my role is to manage heat risk in London. And just one of the examples that we've been doing and working with Arup on is how do we look at which of our buildings, our essential buildings, are going to be impacted by heat. And that includes care homes, hospitals, schools, and also workplaces and neighbourhoods. So essential buildings where we know often vulnerable at-risk groups are, where they can't adapt quickly to climate change. So if you look at the level 4 heat alert that London experienced in 2022, and indeed the whole world globally experienced very high heat events, for the first time, London had a level 4 heat alert, which meant that not just vulnerable people at risk, everybody was at risk from exposure, so risk and exposure to extreme heat. And what the Arup report was doing was saying, well, what happens to occupants in these buildings? So we know many of these buildings are not fit for climate change. They weren't built for climate change and they haven't been adapted. So we have a big retrofit challenge in London. Many of the buildings are old, they're flats, we have single households in those buildings, poorer communities in some of our inner London boroughs where there is poor mitigation. So, you know, impermeable paving, for example, not enough green roofs, not enough trees, and we know there are huge risks. So what are we going to do about retrofitting? So that's a kind of big question for London, and we're doing some major work around that. However, coming back to the data issue, we know there are some limitations, and the work we did with Arup, whilst identified which of those areas and properties and buildings are at risk, there were a number of limitations associated with that. There was limited availability, for example, especially London's building stock, which made it challenging to carry out comprehensive analysis of heat in properties, such as ventilation and solar gains. We know we have an urban heat island in London. So where are these heat spots in relation to the occupants of those buildings? Who are the occupants of the buildings? It's very difficult to know who are the occupants. And I think data and AI is going to really help us identify both for resilience, but also long-term, how do we protect the properties? And then there are a mismatch of data sets. And as was mentioned in the opening presentation by Arup, we have lag, pace, and also data gaps. So London is doing a lot around meeting its zero carbon emission targets and adaptation, but we do have some challenges, particularly around data and availability, accessibility.
That's great, thank you, Annette. And I'd really like to actually pick up on that theme of data availability as well in a moment. But first, I'd really like to hear from Craig about well, where you're from, give a quick blurb, and also how digital approaches have helped you deal with challenges associated with climate change, nature loss, or net zero. That'd be wonderful, thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire, and thank you, Arup, for hosting this important conversation. It's wonderful to be on a panel with all these amazing people doing amazing things around the world. So I am from the Nature Conservancy. We're the world's largest environmental NGO, working across 3 major themes: to provide food and water, to protect lands and waters, and also to address climate change. And one of the main themes of my team's work at the Nature Conservancy is to bridge the gap between promising applications of new technology, and the deliberate and necessary process of incorporating technology-based approaches into existing regulatory and policy-based environments, as Annette just mentioned, with a particular focus on stormwater management and climate resiliency. So my background is in public policy and environmental markets, and I think what I've seen throughout my career is that there's a high degree of desire for innovation throughout government, the NGO sector, and of course the private sector in supplying new technology. However, what often gets overlooked in the digital data and tools conversation is how much translation is needed to get government and communities at large on board. That translation is about making technology seem approachable, useful, and transparent. It's also about fitting those recommendations and insights from those tools into existing regulatory, permitting, and procurement processes. So communities and governments, I think, are often skeptical of receiving this information from companies who might have a vested financial interest in the public utilizing their tools. So it's really important for NGOs like the Nature Conservancy to impartially test new technologies and prove their efficacy so that the private sector can scale up innovation and access new markets. So currently, we are working with Arup to transform how cities and communities plan for siting and managing stormwater infrastructure. Stormwater, I'm sure many people in the audience here know that it's the fastest growing source of water pollution in the world as the world rapidly urbanizes. And what this means is ecosystem loss, flooding, and water quality and availability issues. So to stem the issue, we're testing a novel artificial intelligence and machine learning technique that we're calling smart watershed network management. What this system does is it relies on a lot of technology and data analysis that's already been done. So over the last 10 years, with the decrease in cost in water level turbidity and water pollution sensors, cheap batteries and solar panels, cellular networks that can transmit data securely and reliably, we're now able to integrate real-time weather forecasting and predictions into existing stormwater infrastructure so that it can adapt to conditions on the ground and restore the hydrology of the property that infrastructure is serving, something that I would say is more akin to the way nature or forest might manage water falling on the ground. And what it can also do is it can drain down water in advance of a storm to create more flood storage, which is going to be critical in a rapidly changing climate. However, to date, those projects were really confined to single site installations, and water is complex, pollution transport is complex, and much of our stormwater infrastructure exists on a patchwork of public and private land with various actors responsible for their performance and maintenance. So we asked ourselves, what if all those installations, even though they're managed independently, could communicate with one another so that they could learn and adapt in more precise and geographically appropriate ways? After all, a rainstorm that is affecting one piece of infrastructure upstream will impact the needs of infrastructure downstream. So basically, we told ourselves, we can't tear down the cities that we've built, but what if we can reprogram to act a little bit more like nature? So I'll just wrap up by saying, this is a type of thinking that's the perfect laboratory for new AI tools that we're talking about today. However, unlike things like weather forecasting, where you have billions of data points every second over decades that you can train an AI model on, this is traditionally a low data environment that needs demonstration projects where you can test potential control points and see a response in real time, meaning a relatively small watershed with lots of potential control points. So I can talk more specifically about what we're doing. We're testing this right now in the Indian River Lagoon in Florida, which is a place that has a fantastic group of stakeholders and partners and conditions that make this possible. And it's through groups like NGOs and academic institutions where we can really dive in and test some of these theories out to prove their efficacy, that we can start to bridge that gap that I spoke about at the beginning.
That's really great, Craig. And you mentioned there about, that there was sort of data availability issues. Would you be able to elaborate upon those just briefly?
Sure. So much of our regulatory environment around how we build water infrastructure is based on historical precipitation data. That historical precipitation data is often out of date because we are obviously in a very rapidly changing environment where we're either receiving too much water, we're receiving water in ways that we didn't receive it before in terms of very extreme storm events, or we're receiving less water. So we have less flow going into our rivers and streams, which causes other ecological challenges. And so we set up an environment that's based on these best fit curves of what we think will happen in the future. And so you have 20, 30 years of stormwater infrastructure, at least in the US, that was built on these best fit curves. And frankly, they're not doing anything very well. So what you really need is real-time information, whether that's through level sensors or pollution sensors or things like that, feeding into a system that's constantly adapting. And then you need to enable your infrastructure to be able to adapt in real time as it receives that information. So we can make predictions on weather, we can make predictions on rainfall, but then combining those predictions with some action that actually improves the environment is where there is a data gap at the moment that we are trying to fill.
And based on that data gap, Brady, would you be able to kind of add some comments on that at all?
Well, yeah, so right, let's go with, there's lots of data out there. And then now we have all these other problems that start sprouting up once we start talking about the data. Is the data analytics ready? Because again, I've rarely met somebody that's like, I don't have any data. They usually just don't have the right data. So kind of our focus has been around creating that collection platform, creating a data management for that spatial aspect of that data so that we can give it that, hate to use the term for like the database key, which seems to sound kind of outdated these days, but that key being physical location of the data. Giving you a kind of a point where you can bring all of your data together so that you're sourcing and basically processing against all of your data based off of location. So when I say I'm looking for, and stormwater, in the stormwater analysis piece, not only do I want just the data that was available to me, I want all data associated with that location, because we're back to that, trying to make that digital representation. I need to model all of the data that I have available to me in that location and how it impacts and relates to the other pieces of those worlds. So we get a little bit more into things like graph analysis and bringing in the challenges of AI, which are not necessarily having that analytics ready data. The other piece of that is making that data available to other organizations, right? Whoever that constituent is that needs to consume the data to do their own analysis becomes that other takeaway. So we at ESRI try to empower those constituents with those tools as well so that they can build their own models. I'll leave it at that. I won't dive into too many other things.
No, that's great.
And if I could follow up on that quickly, Claire, just to say, Brady, we obviously use ESRI tools frequently in everything that we do, and there is a tremendous data trove that exists on ESRI servers in the public realm. I think where we are oftentimes challenged is taking all those different disparate data sets from different municipal governments or state governments or even the federal government sometimes, and putting it into a useful system that allows us to make better decisions about what we do. And I will just say, it's shocking when we talk about data availability, Claire, it's shocking to me that it's just recently that the US EPA mandated that all municipalities have their stormwater best management practices mapped and digitized. And that still isn't done for every place because they're lagging behind. They just made it a mandate. And that's critical information that you need to understand what's built to what spec, how is it performing, for what purposes. And once you know all of these things, yes, you can make better decisions, but that information isn't even readily available, and it's in a heterogeneous format as you go from city to city, state to state, municipality to municipality. So that is a perfect example of a data gap that we've been facing and we're trying to help fill or bridge.
That's really great. I'd like to shift a little bit. So we've talked about how digital can enable us to understand and mitigate against the risks with, climate, nature. Remi, I was wondering if there's anything else from your talk. I felt, quite inspired that there were other aspects in your donut. What other aspects should we be using for digital approaches to help with the whole system? You talk about it as a system, that the system is not just nature, it's not just climate. What other aspects would be relevant here?
Wow, that's a difficult question. And when you look a bit at the global models about macroeconomics today existing, there is no really the mention of digital as an infrastructure or as an optimizer of the end sector of the economy, right? And recently, even on the last IPCC report, that was about 2 years ago, you have now a lot of aspects about energy transition and the global impact on the environment, but still the systemic effect of digital on all that for doing prospective scenario, we don't know so much. So it's a very, very vast topic. And again, I think we need to continue to make research and try to understand how to better position digital as a very physical and material topic within the economy for the good and for the bad, right? And what is absolutely needed to me is being capable to quantify much better the positive or the negative effects of digital. And this is coming very, very interestingly on the debate. For about 2 years, there are more and more interesting methodologies which are helping to quantify all the effects of digitalization. Now, Europe is working strongly on that, but also some private sectors and some public sectors. And I think the big challenge will be to find a way to make much more explicit how everything the presenters present today, which are great ideas of innovation and new technology, and new use cases for better planet, show evidence and quantify evidence. And here we have still a gap, both at the macroeconomic level, but also in terms of econometry and the right quantification of the effects.
That's really great. All right, we don't have very long left for this session. I'd really like to Melanie and Annette in just to kind of leave some concluding remarks. I know that Melanie, you wanted to talk about circular economy, and Annette, I'd really like you to talk more about the inequalities. Maybe Annette, if you go first, and then Melanie, if you can talk more about the circular economy aspects. That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. So for London, climate change is a social justice issue. We know that climate disproportionately impacts. It doesn't discriminate, and it disproportionately impacts on those at risk. So it tends to be older people, younger people, those with pre-existing health conditions. The evidence is there, it's very clear. In 2022, we had over 300 excess heat mortality deaths. They were largely around older people. And so the thread running through all our policies has to be the equalities impact assessment and how climate impacts these groups. We know we have a lot of data on kind of looking at London spatially, kind of where the heat hotspots are, where the flood hotspots are, where we need to put more emphasis on energy efficiency. What we need to do much better is understand where and who lives in these buildings and how we're going to kind of readdress the inequalities. It's a very difficult issue because a lot of data is protected around people in buildings, so we can't always extrapolate that data. And that's where AI and digital technology is going to really, really help. For example, you have single households living on their own, having domiciliary care. We know very little about these single households. We may know a little bit more about who's in schools and who's in care homes and who are offices, but we've got these pockets of vulnerability next to high risk climate areas, and those are the things we need to address much more, and we think that that's where London needs to move towards in terms of really building on artificial intelligence whilst we're meeting our net zero. And Remi talked about coupling around net zero. We talk about combining and integrating mitigation and adaptation. So if you're tending to energy efficiency, look at cooling, look at how we're going to make homes warmer, buildings warmer for the winter, but also cooler for the summer. Heat waves and climate impacts are already impacting, and they're going to impact. So how do we forecast for 10 years, 20 years time? How do we know when a flood risk is going to happen in 10 years time? What tends to happen in London is we get early warning systems 3-4 days before. And if our population is expected to prepare, respond and recover, that's a very short time frame. And if you add vulnerability and risk to that, that's even short, which increases the risk of mortality. So what we need to know is how AI is going to help us predict in 10 years time, and then how our 32 boroughs can really begin to invest. So green finance, investing into making sure that we're adapting and mitigating at the same time, which will help bring down inequalities as well, because we will begin to know who these target populations are and how do we really put our finance into those areas to kind of mitigate and adapt.
That's really great and very inspirational to hear. So that's wonderful. And then over to Melanie, just for the last comment.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm really excited about, although not working on directly, is that we're really now at a place where we can start imagining how we can leverage digital to operationalize the circular economy of material systems and address embodied carbon from our built environment. At the construction side, AI-enabled augmented reality paired with edge computing can streamline our material efficiencies. And we should be able to go beyond that as well to leverage blockchain to track the life cycle of materials from disassembly to reuse. Imagine an AI-enabled material bank monitoring available reusable and excess materials from construction sites, and then reducing the transaction costs of brokering, collection, and distribution of recovered material. And that should become as easy and reliable as sourcing new material. With the help of digital, the building industry should be able to move from sourcing reclaimed wood for special landmark projects to operating a complex scaled material and product reuse ecosystem. So that's what I would end with, Claire.
That's wonderful. And that actually relates to one of our questions, I believe, from the audience. So I have a question here. How do you think digital can facilitate the adoption of green construction materials despite their perceived low performance relative to traditional materials? Would anyone like to answer that question? Maybe over to Melanie for that one, or Craig.
Sorry, what was it again?
How do you think digital can facilitate the adoption of green construction materials? That's the main point of the question.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit to the side of our conversation, but we're seeing really fantastic advances in material innovation, and I think that the kind of ability to rapidly model what those molecules and what those materials can do, we're going to vastly expand what can be done and then reused or decomposed. So I'm quite excited to see that continue to expand.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, the one plug I'll put there for facilitating adoption really is also about taking those great examples and raising them up for the policymaker and governmental leaders that set the standards for buildings, so that those too can rapidly change, so that adoption isn't stymied by outdated regulatory models.
Okay, I have another question. This one's for Annette. Is London's focus solely on enhancing the climate resilience of existing buildings, or are you also taking proactive measures to ensure that new construction design are more climate resilient in anticipation of worsening impacts of climate change?
Thank you, and thank you to that person who asked the question. Yes, we have the London Plan, and the London Plan sets the approach for new developments. And so within the London Plan, there is a clear strategy for how and when materials should be used. So, for example, the new London Plan very much focuses on use of permeable pavements and ensuring that new developments aren't using materials that are going to either increase the intensification of the urban heat island, for example, or increase heat getting into buildings. So very much there is an emphasis on that, and how to use more green infrastructure and blue infrastructure in terms of kind of cooling and shading and other aspects as well. And of course, there is the kind of energy hierarchy that we have and cooling hierarchy in the London Plan.
That's great, thank you. I have another question from the audience. How would we tackle AI's high energy consumption, particularly fossil fuels and the use of water for refrigeration? So I'm going to pass on over to Remi, I think, if that's okay.
Sure, just demuting. Yeah, so the answer is systemic. That's an easy one, but there are a lot of pathways. One is about decarbonizing the electric consumption of data centers, because at the end of the day, it's about using data centers. And there are a lot of different data centers, from hyperscalers to co-location, and there is a lot of dependency on the location of the data center. So more you have local territorial data centers with a high energy mix, which is already decarbonized, better it is for your AI model. So this is one, and this is happening in many countries. At the same time, we see this curve of compute training growth exponential, right? But we must admit also that the big companies like NVIDIA, TSMC doing these GPUs are super powerful, and I think they can make a lot of hardware and software improvements. And then there is maybe a third point coming to my mind, which is there is maybe also a kind of public or civilizational debate about AI, because we see that there are somehow two trajectories. There is this traditional AI, where we know we have already a lot of positive impacts, and we have this new Gen AI with potentially very positive impacts on some areas, but also some question marks on some specific usage. And here, I think the debate is far too low. And it started a bit in some countries, but we will need some decisions. And there are already some countries where the grid in the US, in the Netherlands, in Ireland is already very saturated by the development of Gen AI. So it's also a socio-economical, political topic that we need to anticipate.
That's great. I have a question about the cost associated with covering for, what about maintenance of sensors and updating of software? Who will cover these costs over the years? And will we have to pay every 3 years to update these systems, for example? Let's see, I think maybe Craig or Brady would be a good person to answer that question. The technologies involved.
So technology and refresh is, there's a great question on who's gonna be burdened with the cost. Ultimately, we all are. End of the day, we all share that burden. It's how we recover those costs outside of that. So if we say that we're passing those costs on to the municipalities that are collecting it, guess what? They're going to have to collect that cost associated with it. There's some optimization as far as contractually what you can do, obviously, right? Now my sales director title starts coming into the play, and it's like, it comes down to how do you minimize the costs of updating sensors often while still managing to capture the data that you need. And then, kind of talking through with Annette on the things that when we do new buildings, the capture of new technology and new capabilities. Ultimately, we should be looking at things that aren't refreshing every 3 years. We should be looking at a much longer term sensor package for collecting that data. But I don't think there's a really easy answer to say who's going to cover that cost.
But the way that I would answer this question is that, what's the downside of not having the type of useful information that you need to monitor and manage the critical systems that support your economy, society, community safety, et cetera? Because when they fail, and you're not aware that they're about to fail, but could be if you had better data and better sensors, that cost is exorbitantly high. So being able to mandate techniques that are available, low cost, tested for efficacy, et cetera, and distribute those among both the public and private sector. So the private sector in this place would be real estate developers building new buildings, et cetera. Then you're able to decrease the cost of those things over time because there's just a greater supply, of folks that are purchasing them, and it brings that cost down, just like we've seen with solar. And you get better information and better data, so you're not drawing from the pool of capital, for emergency situations as readily as you otherwise would when you have so many aspects of the climate crisis coming to the fore that are typically thrust upon the public sector, but if better planned for and distributed between the public and the private sector, might be a lower cost overall to society.
That's great. And just one very, very quick question. Well, what are your thoughts on the absence of getting critical data actually understood on the ground? So for communities to understand and implement any sort of solutions, I guess. And Annette, I'm going to just pass that one over to you to conclude, and then I'll just give a summary.
Thanks, Claire. Very, very important question, and at the nub of how we tackle climate change is how we bring our communities along with us and to get the public to really understand data. So in London, one of the examples we use is the air quality work we've been doing. And when the mayor first came into administration some years ago, air quality was a very, very tiny area understood by the public. And once we started working around schools and getting kids to understand data, they were the advocates. They were the advocates who started telling their parents, their teachers, etc., kind of, come on, we can see this data, you know, we can see what we need to do, and started knocking on the mayor's doors and writing letters, etc. And the mayor responded. And as long story short, we put heat sensors around, air quality sensors around schools, etc. Kids started extrapolating, not kids, but the parents started extrapolating that data, and teachers, and air quality went up the agenda, began to really be understood. So what we need to do is get advocates, powerful advocates on the ground to understand the data, to promote the data, and then to make it really live and understood. That's one of the areas, but I think it's a really important challenge for us all. How do we get the public engaged in this, and how do we get the public to understand data and then become the actors in helping us meet the challenges of climate change?
That's wonderful, thank you. And I think we will stop there. That is a fantastic end to this panel. I'm just going to quickly summarise. I wanted to say thank you to all of you. That was truly inspirational, very, very interesting. So we've heard that there are many challenges relating to achieving net zero, increasing our climate resilience and our restoration of nature. I feel that there is hope, though, from our discussions today that digital approaches will be key to our climate and nature aspirations. We heard from Remi that digital will be essential for the paradigm shift away from industrial, high consumption-based economies that cause climate change and nature loss. We have heard that nature and climate are important components, but to adopt a truly systemic approach, we really need to incorporate social challenges such as reducing poverty and inequalities to make positive changes for both people and planet. We need to consider the living planetary boundaries, living within planetary boundaries, and that there is an ecological ceiling to how much we can overexploit nature and biodiversity, and that circular economies will be key to decoupling this economic activity from resource consumption. We also heard that collectively we still talk about climate change and nature loss as if they are upcoming problems, but the reality is that we are still in the midst of the nature crisis and the climate emergency now. We urgently need to understand and mitigate the risks associated with nature loss and climate change, and we know that these consequences are severe. So we know that there's an urgent shift is needed, and digital approaches will be essential to drive this change to help us deliver a net zero, climate resilient and nature positive world. Thank you again to all our panelists. It has been really inspiring to hear about how we're using digital approaches towards net zero and climate change and nature. Thank you to the event organisers, and thank you to you, the audience, for attending this webinar. And here's a reminder for our webinar tomorrow. We will have another one on this Digital Horizon series, how are digital twins and digital asset management accelerating decarbonisation? Thank you and have a great day.